How does one navigate the inferno of our world when reason and rationality, like fragile glass, shatter in the searing heat of our harsh reality? We are far from the first people to ask this question. And in the 1940s, the philosopher and writer Albert Camus gave a particularly radical answer. But who was Albert Camus? Born in Algiers on November 7, 1913, Albert Camus grew up in a humble family, raised by a strict grandmother as his father had died in World War I when he was an infant. Despite challenging circumstances, he maintained a deep bond with his illiterate, half-deaf mother. And against all odds, with the support of dedicated teachers, he earned a philosophy degree from the University of Algiers in 1935, completing an ambitious thesis called Christian Metaphysics and Neoplatonism. Camus made his debut as writer in 1937, but he achieved true recognition with his 1942 novel, The Stranger, exploring life's absurdity. In 1957, he was awarded the Nobel Prize, largely due to his works The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus. The Stranger, one of the most widely published French novels of the 20th century and the cornerstone of existentialism, was completed just before German troops entered Paris. At the same time, he wrote his philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, which theoretically explains the thoughts behind the lines of The Stranger. In The Stranger, Camus introduces us to protagonist Arthur Meursalt, residing in 1930s colonial Algeria. The story begins with Meursalt's mother's passing, initially appearing to have little influence on his life or the unfolding story. By page 40, one might almost forget this beginning. The reason lies in Meursalt's remarkably composed response to his mother's death, as evident in his initial thoughts. The home for aged persons is at Marengo, some 50 miles away from Algiers. With the 2 o'clock bus, I should get there well before nightfall. The protagonist doesn't reflect his emotions regarding his deaf mother or her individuality. Instead, he focuses on the practicality of organizing her funeral and returning to his routine. The first part of the novel concludes with Meursalt reflecting. It occurred to me that somehow I'd got through another Sunday, that mother now was buried and tomorrow I'd be going back to work as usual. Really, nothing in my life had changed. As readers, we experience from the very first pages the protagonist's solipsistic world, entirely self-centered and seemingly insulated from others. Meursalt directs his introspection towards his inner life and well-being, paying scant attention to emotional and social dimensions. Mary came that evening and asked me if I'd marry her. I said I didn't mind. If she was keen on it, we'd get married. In many other narratives, Meursalt might be portrayed as an intentionally unsympathetic character, possibly even an antagonist. However, in Camus' exploration, Meursalt embodies a distinct approach to life, one that champions personal authenticity and transcends arbitrary societal conventions and expectations. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus presents 4 main arguments for the meaninglessness of the world. First, while many of the parts and aspects that make up the world interact with each other, there's no absolute truth or objective reality that can explain and define it all, because every explanation or interpretation of the world is subjective and created by ourselves. Second, there is no divine order. Some people's idea of a divine plan is an illusion that is reassuring to some, but nothing more. Third, human existence is finite, and if we know our death and know that there is no infinite continuance, neither can there be any attainable absolute meaning or purpose of death give existence. Fourth, the world is inherently chaotic and unpredictable. Accordingly, there is no guarantee that our plans and efforts will be successful, and it is an illusion that we can consciously direct our lives at all. According to Camus, it is an important step to understand the meaninglessness of the world and everyday life, and not to sacrifice oneself in the hope of a different, meaningful life that can somehow be achieved. For Camus, Hope is nothing more than an escape from the realization of absurdity. At the same time, the world demands a completely different behavior from the protagonist in The Stranger, one that is aligned with social conventions, that he mourns his mother, he loves his girlfriend, he keeps himself away from shady characters. When these demands come up, Meursalt seems almost irritated by it. The fact that Meursalt is not willing and perhaps not able to adapt to this convention takes him to court in the course of the novel and becomes his undoing there. Because through a whole A-series of circumstances that the protagonist, by his own nature, simply indulges in, eventually commits murder. What leads him to this point is, for example, that he allows a friendship to develop between himself and a pimp. I deliberately say allows because Meursalt does not actively seek friendship, he simply allows it, in the sense that he has no control anyway. So now we're pals, ain't we? I kept silence and he said it again. I didn't care, one way or the other, but as he seemed so set on it, I nodded and said yes. In court, we experience how Meursalt is not convicted because he killed someone, but much more, and here we come full circle to the beginning of the novel, because he did not deal with the death of his mother in a socially acceptable way, which emphasizes the absurdity of social conventions. Gentlemen of the jury, I would have you note that on the next day after his mother's funeral, that man was visiting the swimming pool, starting a liaison with a girl, and going to see a comic film. That's all I wish to say. At the end of the story, Meursalt is in a cell. He was sentenced to death, and we can witness how he comes to a crucial realization. Too late for him, of course. And I too felt ready to start life all over again. It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and gazing up at the dark sky spangled with its signs and stars for the first time, the first I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe. To feel it so like myself, indeed so brotherly, made me realize that I'd been happy, and that I was happy still. The protagonist understands that if he fully internalizes and acknowledges the absurdity of life, he can live a free, happy life, and that he has even lived such a life, which makes even the final conclusion of the novel subject to certain meaninglessness. In the end, Meursalt arrives at the solution that Camus describes as the dilemma of life's absurdity. In the Myth of Sisyphus, he asks us to realize that life is meaningless, but he does not mean that we should despair. Instead, we can still live our own way, breaking away from societal conventions and exercising our freedom. Realizing the absurdity of existence becomes the only possible key to our liberation, and this is how the Myth of Sisyphus ends, in relation to the story of Greek mythology in which Sisyphus in the underworld has to roll a boulder up a mountain forever, which just before the top keeps rolling down again, a symbol of insignificance, which Camus finalizes: one must imagine Sisyphus happy.